Hi, today I want to talk about one of the assets you're going to need in order to craft a really good pitch to podcast hosts to have them invite you on as a guest to their podcast. This is an asset that you'll need. So I've talked a little bit about the preparation of you from a mindset point of view, from understanding your audience, also from giving value and making sure that you engage with the podcast host and start to build a relationship. Now, this is an asset, what I'm talking about today, that you will need to make it easier for the podcast host to understand where you're coming from, to understand what value you will bring to their podcast, and also what experience you have. And this is called the speakers page or the podcast presenters page, or sometimes it's referred to as a podcaster's one page. Now, there's a number of ways of doing this. You can have it nicely designed as a PDF document, virtually as a brochure. You can put it as a page on your website like I have, or you can have it as a Google Doc, for example, so that that's not really the important part. The important part is what's in it, the content and the information that it gives the podcast host. And secondly, that it's easily accessible for that potential podcast host that you're pitching to. So first of all, the focus is on giving value to your podcast host and their audience. That's always the very first thing you start with. Then make it easy for the host. I've said, what you use to present this document is important from the point of view of making it easy for the host to access. And also you want to set it out in a way that makes it easy for the host to say, yes, you'll be a fantastic guest for my podcast. And I already know a lot about you. I'm already prepared in some way to have a really meaningful conversation with you. So what kind of information does the one page or the speakers or podcasters page need to have? Well, first of all, your contact details. Obviously, the host needs to be able to get in touch with you through email, maybe the social media, and they may want to give their listeners the ability to contact you when you've been on the podcast also. So that information is really important. Now, a short bio, and couch it in a way that the podcast host can actually use it to introduce you. So how would you like to be introduced? Keep it quite short, because most podcasters will do a very short introduction before starting a conversation. List your relevant experience. And when I say relevant, again, it comes back to what value does it provide to your ideal listener, to your ideal podcast host. Then what are the possible topics that you might be able to talk about? So list a bunch of options here, because not every podcast host will find one option as attractive as you might think. So list several options there of topics that you're comfortable talking about and where you can add value to your ideal audience. Then it's good to have your previous guest appearances listed there. And on my podcast page, I've actually linked into those episodes directly, so that anyone visiting that page who's interested in having me as a podcast guest and finding out more about me can listen directly from that page to my other interviews, so they know how I performed on those interviews, and they can then decide whether they like me or not. The other thing I have there, and I would certainly recommend that, is give the potential podcast host some example questions of what they might be able to ask you. And these are typically just conversation starters. So they're not intended to be the total script for your appearance on that show, but just conversation starters, things that you know will trigger a conversation, and provided you get engagement with your podcast host, there'll be a really deep and meaningful conversation that follows. Have them high level, have them focused on topics rather than a really specific question. Now, of course, you might want a very specific question. For example, if you've just recently published a book, you might want your podcast host to ask you about the book. So include any specifics like that in the questions that you'd like asked. And finally, I have a booking form on the page as well. So if you're putting your speakers page or your podcasters page on a website, then you have the ability to put a booking form there as well. Or if you're doing it as a separate document, then perhaps think about linking out to a booking form separately somewhere, where ultimately, when you do a lot of podcasting, whether it's guesting or whether it's running your own podcast, people will actually come to you and invite you onto their show. And then the podcast booking form will just make it a lot easier to manage the process from there. So they're my tips. Put together your Podcast One page. It's a critical asset for pitching to podcasts as a guest. Have it in a place that's easy to access for potential podcast hosts and include the information that I've mentioned. Stay awesome, and let's make marketing human again.